just want to really welcome you warmly to Johannesburg. It was a rainy day today. It was a rainy week. We had a cyclone in Mozambique and Zimbabwe, and we are seeing the after effects of that cyclone in Johannesburg. However, where Karen Murphy is in New York, it is snowing, and I can see many friends, and Maud, our beautiful friend, a survivor of the Holocaust, also I think has snow all around her. So it is absolutely wonderful to welcome such good friends. I see many teachers that joined us, some academics that joined us, friends from the Durban Holocaust and Genocide Center and the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center. I see Board of Trustees members that joined us, and of course, our dear, dear Holocaust survivors. So Maud is here, Reba Metzner is here, and I will see if anyone else is also joining us. The topic of today's discussion is really very timely, and we are dealing with this question for quite a while now, as trends started to change in Europe, in Asia, in South America, in Africa, in North America. We started to ask ourselves the question, what is happening? Why things are changing? Did we get to a place where those words of the never again that we said after the Second World War and the Holocaust, and all those laws and conventions and framework that we worked on, are they still with us? Are we moving away from them? And when Karen, my dear friend and colleague for many, many years, said, why should we not deal with these issues together, facing history and ourselves, together with the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center? We thought it's a great idea. So we will look at increasing isolationism, at nationalism, at populism, at fragile democracies around the world. And specifically in this age of COVID-19, when we mostly at home, watching a lot of TV and reflecting on all those issues so much. So Karen will help us to look at where we are, what can we learn from the past, and where do we go from here? And we really have such a privilege an honor, may I say, to work with Facing History and Ourselves for many years. Karen, I think that I became a fellow probably about 20 years ago. It looks absolutely unbelievable, or maybe more than 20 years ago. And we hosted you many times in Johannesburg. And I think that there is no one better to take us through tonight's topic than Dr. Karen Murphy and Facing History and Ourselves. So just briefly to introduce Karen officially to you, Dr. Karen Murphy is Director of International Strategy for Facing History and Ourselves, a global nonprofit organization that has been working with South African educators, schools, civil society, organizations, and memory institutions like our own, like the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, but our sister centers as well, and many other friends in this field since 2003. Karen, the floor is yours, and I will invite everyone to post their thoughts and maybe some connections that you are making and questions that come up to you in the chat, and Karen will see it and we will help her seeing it as we go along. Karen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tali. Thank you for your vision and your generosity. Tali was one of the first people who welcomed me and welcomed Facing History and Ourselves into South Africa. I sat in her car many, many times as she drove around the Johannesburg traffic to a meeting or to take us to an institution or to introduce us to someone. And I think that one of the qualities I want to raise about Tali is also an essential thing I want us to think about today. And that is at the heart of democracy, which we will talk about today, is relationship. Relationships are the foundation of democracy. And it's trust that is the glue that holds those relationships together. And we've seen relationships between and among people in countries, between people and their elected representatives, between people and the idea of democracy, challenged and wither. And certainly a component of that is the damage that has been done to these relationships, both historically. It's also increasing segregation and isolationism that COVID has exacerbated. And a component of that is the fact that we actually don't have shared stories. We don't have shared commitments. And increasingly, because of social media, we don't go to the same places for information. We don't have shared facts. And for those of you who are in the United States or have watched the United States, you've seen a dramatic and painful example, I think, of how much that is really challenging our democracy and our society. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about Facing History. I know you can get more information about us on our site. As Tali will tell you, I'll respond to anybody's email. You can get in touch with me directly. Our partner in South Africa over the many years has been Shakaya, based in the Western Cape, but they work countrywide. And we work closely with Tali, and as Tali said, the partner Holocaust centers. And we're very committed to that work. So Facing History, actually, like the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, is very much a child of the World War II commitments we're going to talk about, to the idea of history being important, to memory, to facing the past and confronting its legacies, to developing citizens who will support democratic norms and behaviors, and the idea that rights matter, that people should take care of each other across borders and boundaries, that we're in a desperate place where the only things that matter to us are based on if you look the same, eat the same, pray the same, speak the same language, then you'll care about those people who look like you, pray like you, eat like you, think like you, and so on. Facing History, just like the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, very much presses against that idea, and is at once faithful to the particularities of the histories we look at, and at the same time committed to this idea that there are universal norms and rights and protections and aspects of human behavior. And some of them that we're dealing with now are some of the scarier ones. Facing History began in the 1970s in Boston, Massachusetts, and it was created by a teacher, two teachers actually, but one of those teachers was, as a child, a white Jewish woman growing up in Memphis, Tennessee. And she saw, there's something wrong here, that I'm sitting in my classroom with all white students, that the textbook we use are brand new. And then when these textbooks get very old, that's when they go to the Black schools. She knew that the zoo that was behind her school was open to Black children only one afternoon a week. She saw the water fountains that said white and colored. And she knew that there was not just a problem there about her society. She knew her teachers weren't telling her the truth about it, because she could get an A in ethics and an A in history that never talked about these things that were happening right outside her doors. So she felt betrayed. She said, this makes no sense. The stuff I need to actually be a citizen in the society is not the stuff that we're doing in school. And in fact, I don't even know what my teachers believe. I don't even know what they think. Like, do they ask questions about this stuff? So when she became a teacher herself in Boston many years later, she was also a graduate student at Harvard, and she was studying moral development and adolescent development. And she was invited to go to a Holocaust conference. And once again, she said to herself, how is it possible that I'm now a grown woman? I was a history major, and I never knew this history. What is happening when you don't know something so critical? So her principal, who was very much a visionary, said, look, you have my permission to figure out a way to teach this history, making connections to the world around our kids, to your students. And it has to be appropriate to their development as adolescents. And Facing History was really created out of that sort of series of things, and also a moment for sure in the United States in the 1970s, where I think educators were being a little more creative. It was the wake of the civil rights movement. Lots of questions were being asked, and there was an energy. And actually, I went to elementary school in the 70s, and I'm not saying my experience wasn't like everybody else's, believe me, but I remember busing. I remember things like my teachers doing social studies. I didn't realize that was new. When you're a kid, you're just experiencing the thing that the adults are doing. But Facing History was very much part of this experimental period. And since that time, we've obviously grown. Facing History now is an organization across the United States. We have an office in Canada, in the UK, and partnerships around the world. And we also look at other case studies. Now, one of the things we're going to talk about today is our name is Facing History and Ourselves. And that ourselves part is so important, because we know that we will be betraying our children and our teachers, for that matter, if we hermetically seal not just history, but particular events, so that when people are looking outside their door, I live in New York City. And all spring and early summer, there were kids on the street right outside my window protesting for racial justice, right? What kind of planet would I live on to pretend that what was happening outside my windows was not part of my lived experience? And yet we know that that's how we live. That's sometimes how we teach, with no connection between the words coming out of our mouths and the things we're looking at and what's actually happening in the lives of our students and our own lives. So I want to just say a few of those post-World War II commitments that I think are part of like the spinal cord of that period, and also inform our thinking. And some of those would be, the rule of law and the idea of accountability. And we see that with Nuremberg trials and the formation of the international criminal tribunals and other mechanisms that say, you do wrong, you commit massive human rights violations, including especially genocide or rape. If a leader does things to his people or her people, they have to be held accountable. Or this idea, for example, of command responsibility. You can't say I was just following orders. Rights and the formation of, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The formation of the United Nations itself, imperfect. I heard Yehuda Bauer one time say, and this is, Yehuda said it, I'll say, but he said, it's imperfect. It's not the institution I would necessarily choose, but it's the only one I've got. It's like my mother-in-law. So, okay, Yehuda said that with a big smile on his face, but you get the idea. It is the only one we've got. That is the only institution that is really bringing the range of countries together to imagine norms and commitments and other things. It is a broken system. It's also the only one we have. Prevention, the Genocide Convention, the idea that there was actually some kind of commitment, again, not legally bound, but a commitment to prevention and to punishment. And then two other commitments I want to mention, and these are being equally strained right now, and that's a commitment to history. And that means not that we all have the same history, not that we necessarily all agree on the implications of history, but we have some shared facts. We have some shared stories. We have shared truths. And one of these, I would say, is the Holocaust. and how much work institutions and individuals, scholars, educators, civil society representatives have done to say, you know, this is actually a big complex story, but there are facts and elements of this story that cannot be denied, that are indisputable, and that are essential to our understanding of not just the past, but ourselves as human beings and what we're capable of. There are other examples of that as well. We're very much getting to a place where the idea of that kind of sharedness is very fraught, which we'll talk about in a moment. The other is this idea of memory, to witnessing, to witnesses. I understand there are survivors on this webinar. I know that a couple of days ago you celebrated Holocaust Memorial Day. There certainly is the pressing question now. Is it only the responsibility of people of the targeted group to remember? What happens when those people are no longer with us? Are we actually suggesting that you have to be of that identity group to be responsible for memory? And this is where Facing History and the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center very much contests that idea. We refer to Helen Fine, who's a genocide scholar's idea, universe of obligation. That idea that your universe of obligation, who you feel obligated to, who you feel responsible for, is something that you should work to make more and more inclusive. Not just the people who look, pray, feel like you. It's Black History Month right now in the United States. If I were to say as a white woman, I don't have anything to do with that, what does that suggest about my responsibilities in my democracy, as well as what it means to make that connection between history and democracy? So I want to open this session by listening to and watching two survivors. One is a survivor of the Holocaust, Sonia Weitz, who was very, very close to Facing History. Sonia was a poet, and I invite you to find her poetry. We have a lot of it on our site. Wow, what a gorgeous woman Sonia Weitz was. So dedicated also to being in the classroom with young people. So we'll listen to Sonia, and then we're going to listen to a young woman who's a survivor of the genocide in Darfur, a genocide that took place 60 years later after the genocide that took Sonia's family. After we listen to these two women, what I'd like you to do is just take a couple of moments in a notebook and write some reflections. And after you've had maybe 2 or 3 minutes to write a reflection to yourself, I'd like you to put some of those reflections in the chat, and let's just talk about them a little bit. But again, part of the reason why we're listening to this testimony is going back to this idea that it matters, that history and memory matter. So let me share my screen and make sure everything is optimized so that it works properly. Okay. Hold on 1 second.
I too was a child when the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939. My 6 years of darkness include the Krakow ghetto, Plaszow, Auschwitz, the Death March, cattle cars, Bergen-Belsen, and finally, Mauthausen. You see, when I was a little girl, the world was comprised of two kinds of nations: those that would not allow the Jews out, and those that would not allow the Jews in. Immigration requirements were impossible, and there was no Israel. And so we were trapped and we were slaughtered. For me, the devastation was complete. My mother was killed in the death camp in Belzec, my father in Mauthausen. Out of a family of 84, only my sister Blanca and I survived. Mark suggested that each of us share a vivid memory, and boy, did I struggle with that, because most of my memories, especially the bad ones, are very, very vivid. And I decided on a memory from Bergen-Belsen, which I believe was worse than Auschwitz. And some of this unspeakable horror is depicted, again, I'm forever leaning on my poetry. It's depicted in the poem I call Icicles. But let me explain. Bergen-Belsen was a death trap. There was no work. There were the barracks, 400 women in a barracks that was meant for 40 maybe. No blankets, no bunks. We were not fed in that camp at all. Because we didn't work. And so the only food we ever had was something we would manage to steal going behind the German kitchens. Of course, if you were caught, you were shot. And so I remember endless hours in that camp, standing on the roll calls, and very little is being said about the Appellplatz. The horror of standing there sometimes for 14 hours. And so numb beyond pain, I very often fantasized, and I wrote poems in my head. This poem is called Icicles. The wind is brutal, the rain icy cold. I shiver and hold out my empty fists. My stomach twists with hollow cramps. The hunger, not unbearable. It dulls my wits and sets my mind aswim. My vision dims most pleasantly. I tremble, I weep, and quite detached, I watch myself. Am I asleep, or do I now belong among the dead? And yet I know I am alive. I know because along my bony cheek a tear escapes. It quickly turns to ice. How nice to remember, to see. I see icicles and me. A little girl, a windowsill, and frost upon the pane, and down the lane a friend. My mother's voice, the smell of food, my father's laughter fills the air. I sigh, I stare. The wind has chased my dream away and left but emptiness. The icicles now burn my lips. They turn to salt, it's true. There are no bitter tears, 'cause tears and blood, sweat too, they all taste salty, tart, and bitterness, bitterness, that dwells within my heart. I am cold, hungry, I hurt. Does anyone know I am here? Does anyone care? Thank you.
Okay, I want you to just take a moment and we'll listen to the next testimony in a minute, but let's just sit with Sonia. Okay. Sorry, I can clearly only do one thing at a time.
I was 10 years old when I learned what the word genocide meant. It was 2003, and my people were being brutally attacked because of their race. Hundreds of thousands murdered, millions displaced, a nation torn apart at the hands of its own government. My mother and father immediately began speaking out against the crisis. I didn't really understand it, except for the fact that it was destroying my parents. One day, I walked in on my mother crying, and I asked her why we were burying so many people. I don't remember the words that she chose to describe genocide to her 10-year-old daughter, but I remember the feeling. We felt completely alone, as if no one could hear us, as if we were essentially invisible. This is when I wrote my first poem about Darfur. I wrote poetry to convince people to hear and see us. And that's how I learned the thing that changed me. It's easy to be seen. I mean, look at me. I'm a young African woman with a scarf around my head, an American accent on my tongue, and a story that makes even the most brutal of Monday mornings seem inviting. But it's hard to convince people that they deserve to be seen. I learned this in my high school classroom one day when my teacher asked me to give a presentation about Darfur. I was setting up the projector when a classmate of mine said, "Why do you have to talk about this? Can't you think about us and how it'll make us feel?" My 14-year-old self didn't know what to say to her or how to explain the pain that I felt in that moment and in every moment that we were forced not to talk about this. Her words took me back to the days and nights on the ground in Darfur, where we were forced to remain silent, where we didn't speak over morning tea because the war planes overhead would swallow any and all noise. Back to the days where we were told not only that we don't deserve to be heard, but that we do not have a right to exist. And this is where the magic happened. In that classroom, when all the students started taking their seats and I began to speak despite this renewed feeling that I didn't deserve to be there, that I didn't belong there or have a right to break the silence. As I talked and my classmates listened, the fear ebbed away. My mind became calm and I felt safe. It was the sound of our grieving, the feel of their arms around me, the steady walls that held us together. It felt nothing like a vacuum. I choose poetry because it's so visceral. When someone is standing in front of you, mind, body, and soul, saying, "Witness me," it's impossible not to become keenly aware of your own humanity. This changed everything for me. It gave me courage. Every day, I experience the power of witness, and because of that, I am whole. And so now I ask, will you witness me? They hand me the microphone as my shoulders sink under the weight of this dress. The woman says, "The 1 millionth refugee just left South Sudan, can you comment?" I feel my feet rock back and forth on the heels my mother bought, begging the question, do we stay or is it safer to choose flight? My mind echoes the numbers. 1 million gone, 2 million displaced, 400,000 dead in Darfur. And this lump takes over my throat as if each of those bodies just found a grave right here in my esophagus. Our once country, all north and south and east and west, so restless, the Nile couldn't hold us together, and you ask me to summarize. They talk about the numbers as if this isn't still happening, as if 500,000 didn't just die in Syria, as if 3,000 aren't still making their final stand at the bottom of the Mediterranean, as if there aren't entire volumes full of fact sheets about our genocides, and now they want me to write one. Fact. We never talked over breakfast because the warplanes would swallow our voices. Fact. My grandfather didn't want to leave home, so he died in a war zone. Fact. A burning bush without God is just a fire. I measure the distance between what I know and what it's safe to say on a microphone. Do I talk about sorrow, displacement? Do I mention the violence, how it's never as simple as what you see on TV, how there are weeks worth of fear before the camera is on? Do I tell her about our bodies, how they are 60% water, but we still burn like driftwood, making fuel of our sacrifice? Do I tell her the men died first, mothers forced to watch the slaughter, that they came for our children, scattering them across the continent until our homes sank, that even castles sink at the bite of the bomb? Do I talk about the elderly, our heroes, too weak to run, too expensive to shoot, how they would march them, hands raised, rifles at their backs into the fire, how their walking sticks kept the flames alive? It feels too harsh for a bundle of wires in an audience to swallow, too relentless, like the valley that filled with the putrid smoke of our deaths. Is it better in verse? Can a stanza become a burial shroud? Will it sting less if I say it softly? If you don't see me cry, will you listen better? Will the pain leave when the microphone does? Why does every word feel as if I'm saying my last? 30 seconds for the soundbite, and now 3 minutes for the poem. My tongue goes dry, the same way we died, becoming ash, having never been coal. I feel my left leg go numb, and I realize that I locked my knees, bracing for impact. I never wear shoes I can't run in. Thank you. So I wanted to leave on a positive note, because that's the paradox that this life has been. In the places where I learned to cry the most, I also learned how to smile after. And so here goes. You have a big imagination, or 400,000 ways to cry. For Zainab, I am a sad girl, but my face makes other plans, focusing energy on this smile so as not to waste it on pain. The first thing they took was my sleep, eyes heavy but wide open, thinking maybe I missed something. Maybe the cavalry is still coming. They didn't come, so I bought bigger pillows. My grandmother could cure anything by talking the life out of it. And she said that I could make a thief in a silo laugh in the middle of our raging war. War makes a broken marriage bed out of sorrow. You want nothing more than to disappear, but your heart can't salvage enough remnants to leave. But joy is the armor we carried across the borders of our broken hamlet. A hasty mix of stories and faces that last long after the flavor is gone. Of muscle memory that overcomes even the most bitter of times. My memory is spotted with days of laughing until I cried or crying until I laughed. Laughter and tears are both involuntary human reactions, testaments to our capacity for expression. So allow me to express that if I make you laugh, it's usually on purpose. And if I make you cry, I'll still think you are beautiful. This is for my cousin Zainab, bedridden on a random afternoon. I hadn't seen her since the last time we were in Sudan together, and there I was at her hospital bedside in a 400-year-old building in France. Zainab wanted to hear poems. Suddenly, English, Arabic, and French were not enough. Every word I knew became empty noise. And Zainab said, well, get on with it. And I read her everything that I could. And we laughed and we loved it. And it was the most important stage that I've ever stood on. Surrounded by family, by remnants of a people who were given as a dowry to a relentless war, but still managed to make pearls of this life. By the ones who taught me to not only laugh, but to live in the face of death. Who placed their hands across the sky, measuring the distance to the sun and saying, smile, I'm gonna meet you there. And for Zainab who taught me love in a place like France. Zainab who wanted to hear poems on her deathbed. Dilated fibromyalgia. Her heart muscles expanded until they couldn't function. And she held me and she made me feel like gold. And I said, Zainab, isn't it strange that your only problem is that your heart was too big? Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to have you take just a couple of minutes and please write some reflections, just what comes to mind. And then pop them in the chat. If you haven't had the chance, please do share your thoughts. Carol said, joy, love. Vicky, does anyone care? Quoting Sonia. Brenda, powerful, poignant, painful. Carolyn, incredible, her heart was too big while others were cold-hearted, mean, and cruel. Jordan, I never wear shoes that I cannot run in. Marion and Peter Joseph, so that's one of you. The similarity of being unseen and insignificant. Yes, Tali, so similar, 60 years apart, these poets, these women who lost their families. So these testimonies and others are on our website. Yes, trauma that never leaves, be it 70 years ago or 15 years ago. They both made pearls of their lives. Yes. Resilience, intense pain and trauma. And that intersection of resilience and trauma, that you can be traumatized. You can also feel compounded trauma. We know with COVID, that's been the experience for many people actually. And you can be resilient. We also know that with trauma, one of the things that goes sometimes first is the imagination. And how both of these women knew as young women to keep that alive, and the way they use poetry to do that. Does anyone know I'm here? Does anyone care? Yes. So as I was saying, you can find these testimonies on our site, and I can do a follow-up email that Tali can share that also has other materials. One of the things that I would like to do is sort of move us to this other part of the conversation, which is, so in the wake of World War II and the Holocaust, as we discussed, we made these commitments. And I'm not suggesting in any way that because they were aspired to, that it was all done and dusted. And we know those commitments have been challenged over the years, whether the example is Cambodia or Rwanda or Srebrenica. And in the wake of, for example, the Rwandan genocide and the genocide in Srebrenica, it did inspire some people to say, we have to renew this commitment to never again. Kofi Annan, you might remember, apologized on behalf of the UN. Various people apologized and said, you know, we can do better, we can do different. And then there were things that happened. Hotel Rwanda, the film on Rwanda came out. Philip Gorovich's book on Rwanda, Alison Desforges' testimony in Rwanda. The idea that this, in some ways, Rwanda itself, became more visible as an example of failure. And as people learn more about it, especially I think in this case, let's say people in the West, they said, and I'm including also, I would say South Africa played a big role here, started to say, what happened? Why didn't we do anything? And as these connections were being made, the genocide in Darfur was taking place. So some of that anti-genocide energy went to Darfur. And there were a number of years there, 2003, 4, 5, 6, let's say, where we were seeing something like an anti-genocide movement really develop. There were lots of NGOs, in fact. There was more attention. Some of you might remember the big conferences that took place in Stockholm dedicated to the prevention of genocide. It felt like we were on some kind of ascending wave of commitment. And so people were beginning to think, how does this show up in political leadership? Where are the institutions that remember? What does this mean in our school curricula? How are we going to honor these commitments when it comes to international law and policy? We saw the Rome statutes become the International Criminal Court. So there's this period, and then. So in the later 2000s, it wasn't as if people just said no more, but there became a slow and steady retreat. And I remember when these things were happening, because I also remember little components. I remember being in South Africa with Tali in 2007-8. And you remember when, for example, the abuses took place at Free State. And there was a moment of reckoning for South Africans where the question was, wait, these kids were born free. And look what they have done to the people, the staff at Free State, the abuses they had committed. And there was just this moment again of people saying, what's going on? What's going on? And at the same time, there were various crises that South Africa was navigating: energy, the economy, growing inequality, sickness, poor leadership, right? You could zoom in on lots of countries and see a similar thing happening, where there's both a sort of a retreat from the world at the same time that countries are beginning to not just explore what's happening. That's always been a dance. Do we have to take care of what's in our own backyard, or can we have more expansive view of our commitments? But they were more pronounced. And I think I'll give you an example in the United States. I think some people thought with the Obama administration, and for example, Samantha Power in her role, especially after writing the book that she wrote, A Problem from Hell, that there would be more priorities about genocide prevention. And yet we saw not just the challenges of that, but also things happened like in the fall of 2013 with this idea of a red line with Syria. And then we know with the Arab Spring and other things, this question, what does intervention mean? What does it look like? What do you do when you do intervene? What is protection? How does it manifest? What are all the tools in our toolbox? They don't all have to be about war. But can you allow people to be slaughtered and do nothing? In that period, in the wake of World War II, all the way going into the 2000s, we actually developed all kinds of early warning mechanisms. And now we have more people paying attention. And yet, another thing that happened, if you'll remember, is lots and lots of journalists were pulled from their posts around the world as we saw media not care so much about what was happening beyond its borders. So there were many things that started to happen, but we also were seeing a steady rise of populism, anti-democratic behaviors and thinking. We certainly have seen in Eastern and Central Europe the rise of authoritarianism, not just against democracy, but also I think we've also seen something that has manifested in the United States in really powerful ways, but that's just not telling the truth with no accountability, no penalty, and having political leadership both using propaganda and actively lying to citizens who are no longer even sharing similar information. So these questions about what about Darfur, what about the Rohingya, what about, become not just secondary or sometimes third to these other issues, but we're seeing a pulling away even of this idea of universal commitments. I remember in 2015 saying, it's not going to be very long before we're even talking about the shared commitment to the Holocaust. It will be contested. No, that's done. That's done. It's never done. The work of memory is never done. We know this. The work of upholding these commitments is never done. And we don't just pass them on to a generation as if it's osmotic. It's not like breathing the air, especially when the air becomes polluted by nationalism, especially when it becomes polluted by white nationalism. So we've seen lots of changes in the past several years, and some of those changes have included a real retreat from never again. Again, not said out loud. In some places said out loud, but whether it's Brexit or the isolationism, America first, we've seen here, but this idea of not just pulling back, but tied to that, when we see the marriage of white nationalism and populism in some places, the connection is we will take care of our own, not those other people. And usually not those other people are people of color, Jews, the poor, name your group. So one of the things that we've seen, we have, in the United States, a new administration, and certainly there will be questions related to what will it look like as the United States re-enters the world. And in the case of, let's say, our new Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, he's actually a very interesting person for this to be a bit of a case study, because he's the stepson of a Holocaust survivor. He talks about that all the time. And he's very committed to these norms that I talked about at the beginning. And then you have Samantha Power going in, who's going to head USAID. What is that going to look like? And then you have Joe Biden, who is of this post-World War II generation that's very committed to these ideas. So there are these interesting questions, not just rejoining the Paris Accords and other things like that, but what might that look like to imagine these things becoming part of our conversation again, right? Where for 4 years, we've been obsessed with ourselves, and caring about the world requires some energy. So that's one thing I want to consider. The other thing I want to think about, though, is the ongoing work of making those connections between history and ourselves. Because what's happened in the last several years, no matter how much we have political changes, isn't done. We live with its legacies. Charlottesville happened here. The Capitol insurrection was 3 weeks ago, right? I can name whatever I want to name in the list of things. In Germany, it didn't seem possible that that question of a responsibility to memory, to certain behaviors related to the Holocaust specifically, would ever be questioned. And yet we know in the Reichstag, there are now members of parliament who question whether or not that should be a part of German national identity. Isn't something we should get over with? Why should we feel guilty and ashamed? Why should we be accountable? So these questions that seemed so taken for granted, we're reminded once again, we can't take for granted. So the way that I would like to sort of bring things together and invite you for another reflection is by looking at a Facing History reading. And this is a moment in time. And what I'd like you to do is I'm going to ask a few of you to read out loud. And I know that can be awkward, but there's not that many of us. So the way I want you to do it is unmute yourself, like read a paragraph or so, and then someone else jump in. And if we get a little confused or whatever, it's no big deal. Who cares? We're a learning community. We can do this together. Facing history in ourselves is not about facile comparisons. It's about making connections and distinctions. So the idea is there a resonance? Do you see patterns? The value of using history to do this is that these patterns that we can identify, these echoes we can hear, can be useful for us. They can be illuminating, not because we're ever saying 33 is like today, or that 33 was even like 1945. It wasn't, right? So this isn't about a simple conflation of history or a simple comparison. But if you had the chance to read Tim Snyder's piece recently that he wrote for the New York Times on making connections to what is happening in the United States and looking back in history, and I can share that link with you, he's reminding us that, you don't use history to say, oh, this looks just like. Use it as a tool, a lens, a prism to illuminate and to allow you to hear and see and then think. How then, knowing this, should I think about what I'm going to do and what choices I can make? Because I want to remind us all, we still do live in democracies. And part of the problem here for many of us is not that we are powerless. It's what do you do with that? Who are the people extremists will always exist. They will always exist, but you don't need to let them come into power. And whose responsibility is that? So let's look at this one piece. Oy, sorry I keep doing this. Okay, so this is a piece called Controlling the Universities. And as I said, we're going to read it out loud. So would someone please unmute themselves and start?
The 1939 civil service law applied to university professors as well as elementary and secondary school teachers. It was not difficult for the Nazis to win the support of many university professors, administrators, and students. At the time, a majority of them backed conservative political parties that were hostile to the Weimar Republic. Many university professors immediately welcomed the Nazi-led government in 1933. Many students, fraternities, and other student groups already banned Jews and regularly protested against professors they believed did not support supposed traditional German values. Scholars who were Jewish or supported left-leaning parties struggled to find research and teaching positions in public, government-supported German universities and often worked in private ones instead. With the passage of the new law, the Nazis attempted to root out any dissent to their policies and ideology that remained in German higher education.
Peter Drucker, an Austrian economist, was then a lecturer at Frankfurt University. Fearful of Hitler's plans for Germany, he was prepared to leave the country, but hoped that it would not be necessary to do so. The first Nazi-led faculty meeting at the university convinced him otherwise. Frankfurt was the first university the Nazis tackled precisely because it was the most self-confidently liberal of major German universities, with a faculty that prided itself on its allegiance to scholarship, freedom of conscience, and democracy. The Nazis knew that control of Frankfurt University would mean control of German academia, and so did everyone at the university. Above all, Frankfurt had a science faculty distinguished both by its scholarship and by its liberal convictions. And outstanding among the Frankfurt scientists was a biochemist psychologist of Nobel Prize-winning caliber and impeccable liberal credentials. When the appointment of a Nazi commissar was announced, and every teacher and graduate assistant at the university was summoned to a faculty meeting to hear this new master, everybody knew that a trial of strength was at hand. I had never before attended a faculty meeting, but I did attend this one.
The new Nazi commissar wasted no time on the amenities. He immediately announced that Jews would be forbidden to enter university premises and would be dismissed without salary on March 15th. This was something that no one had thought possible, despite the Nazis' loud anti-Semitism. Then he launched into a tirade of abuse, filth, and four-letter words, such as had been heard rarely even in the barracks and never before in academia. He pointed his finger at one department chairman after another and said, "You either do what I tell you or we'll put you into a concentration camp." There was silence when he finished. Everybody waited for the distinguished biochemist physiologist. The great liberal got up, cleared his throat and said, "Very interesting, Mr. Commissar, and in some respects very illuminating. But one point I didn't get too clearly. Will there be more money for research in physiology?" The meeting broke up shortly thereafter with the commissaire assuring the scholars that indeed there would be plenty of money for racially pure science. A few of the professors had the courage to walk out with their Jewish colleagues, but most kept a safe distance from those who only a few hours earlier had been their close friends. I went out sick unto death, and I knew that I was going to leave Germany within 48 hours.
Other professors chose a different course. Martin Heidegger, an influential philosopher, told his students and colleagues that Germany's soul needed fresh air to breathe, and National Socialism would provide it. As the Nazis came to power, he argued that freedom of inquiry and free expression were negative and selfish ideas. Instead, he encouraged his students to live up to their obligations to the national community in both thought and deed. Heidegger's fellow professors at Freiburg University voted him head of the university in April 1933. In May, he officially joined the Nazi Party, and he told his students, "The Führer himself and he alone is the German reality, present and future, and its law. Study to know, from now on, all things demand decision, and all action responsibility. Heil Hitler." According to historian Richard Evans, 15% of university teachers had lost their jobs by fall 1933. Most were fired because of their political beliefs, while a third of those fired were dismissed because they were Jewish. Several world-famous German scientists were fired or left their positions at universities and research institutions across the country. Most notable among them was Albert Einstein. He had revolutionized modern physics while working in Berlin for 20 years, but he left Germany in 1933 and spent the rest of his career at Princeton University in the United States.
Thank you, and thank you all for reading. What I'd like you to do is just take a moment and, oh, I see someone put in, history does not repeat itself, it rhymes. What I'd like you to do is just take a moment and think about this idea of connections or potential rhymes. Where do you hear them and see them? And, you know, you can choose South Africa as your lens, maybe the United States, maybe the world as a whole, but where are you seeing patterns? And again, we're not trying to say 33 is like 2021 or whatever it is, but where are the echoes for you? And when you have one, or you have a couple, or a word or a phrase or something that's jumping out at you, pop it in the chat.
The German opposition is a far-right party, and that's very worrying.
Tali's engagement with Luke here about the courage and effort it's needed to make connections. It's hard to do. I mean, it's hard. One of the things that's happened here, for those of you who are in the US or pay attention to the US, is American exceptionalism, that idea, has gotten away from, it gets in the way of people being able to wrap their heads around the idea that it can happen here. And American exceptionalism can fuel some positive things, this sort of relentless positive energy, this idea that we can do it, we can fix it, we can sort it, you know, whatever. That can also get in the way of really looking in the mirror and also recognizing when things have gone really awry. And we've seen too often that we will be like the frogs who boil in the water. We won't jump out. And so it raises lots of questions. Mary Lee, the looks on the faces of those who took part in the Capitol insurrection brought images of civil rights brutality, Nazi events to yes, yes. The pain that these are also everyday people. Carolyn, some people know things, for example, democracy, anti-hate, and theory, and do not act in accordance with their ideas. Yep. We also have seen the power in these stories and also in our lived experience of this idea, like if one person had stood up, more of us would have stood up. You know, what does it take to be the person who says, this isn't right? We know from Victoria Barnett's work on bystander behavior, for example, that there's lots of studies who have been done on altruism and people who don't perpetrate. And those are often the people who retain this moral outsiderness. So of course, we're always trying to create inclusive societies where people feel a sense of belonging. And it can be very frustrating in a family, in a business, in a school, whatever. When you have that person who's like the squeaky wheel, who says, this isn't right, this isn't fair. But those people, those different voices can keep us more ethical. The challenge is, if we exclude those people, if we make those people marginal, or if we make them different or problematic, we won't hear them. So how do you make it so that, you know, like if you've ever seen that Eye of the Storm, blue-eyed, you know, brown-eyed experiment, there's one little boy in that documentary, Brian, who consistently is pushing back on the teacher who's trying to, you know, do this authoritarian experiment. And the thing is that not only is she good at disempowering him by marginalizing him in the classroom, and he will continue to push back, we also know how much it is that people who resist in other societies are often the outsiders who people start to treat as fringe. You know, so even in the United States, and I've seen in other places, when you have people who do the work of calling out the early warning, it's you're exaggerating. Why are you talking about this? This is not like Weimar. This is not like the 30s. The same thing for genocide prevention. You can't prove it's going to happen, right? Sometimes it doesn't. And this is an example of something we always need to have in our back pocket. A case like Kenya, for example, the post-election violence, and how many people said what's happening here right now has to stop. And high-level diplomacy, the work of civil society actors, they actually did stop it. Okay, so part of what you're seeing here, and I'll go back to this, history does not repeat itself, it rhymes. This is the work of facing history in ourselves. We're trying to, in our work with young people, we work first with teachers, so adults who work with adolescents. So it's multi-generational work with the idea that it's us, we are responsible. We are the ones. We can't wait for other people. And that does, as Tali said, create courage and effort. Vigilance is constant, and being vigilant is exhausting, which is why we need to do it together. And why this post-World War II idea, better together than alone, to face these things, remains such an important and powerful one. Yes, and I see more comment here. Thank you. So I am going to thank you, and I'm going to turn things back to Tali. Thank you so much for your time today. I know it's nighttime in South Africa, and I have to tell you, this is normally the time of year that I go and spend a couple of weeks there working with our partners. I feel deeply connected to South Africa in a whole lot of ways. And one of them goes back to the thing I said at the beginning. And that is because so much of what holds us together is about relationship and commitment. And what South Africans have done also, incomplete, but more than lots of other places, is have the courage to face your violent past and understand that that's something that has to keep happening. It's a courage we don't have yet in the United States. And I appreciate so much your partnership. And also, Tali, I'll say, you know, your love and your passion and your dedication. You're a real champion. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you so much for the lovely words of a friend of, as I said, more than 20 years. I see amazing comments in the spirits of community. If someone would like to, in the last few minutes, want to unmute themselves, share some of your thoughts. I see, Luke, you had some really deep thoughts, if you would like to put the video on and unmute yourself, or anyone else, and then we will close. So yeah, I see Luke, but you will need to unmute yourself.
Hi, Tali. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I mean, I made the point also about the precision in language. I think precise analysis and precision in language is very important, because often people are condemned in very sort of imprecise, very blanket terms. And I think that's ultimately hugely self-defeating.
Yeah, and specifically, I'm interested, Luke's mom is also a Holocaust survivor, and his grandmother was a doctor in the Warsaw Ghetto, and actually, very sadly, went with her patients to Treblinka and was murdered there. And we have Maud with us, that is a survivor from the Netherlands. And I'm just thinking, you know, all those ideas, you know, that we celebrated, but how do we make the connections? And I'm just looking at our world this week, you know, a coup in Myanmar, you know, issues in, you know, in China with the Uyghurs, I mean, genocide in China, and all around us. I just got a notice that Navalny was now persecuted and he's going to jail for 3.5 years. And everyone is quiet. Everyone is quiet. You do not hear any much comments about the, you know, about Myanmar. You do not hear much comments about Russia. Thinking about Hong Kong, they thought if they will demonstrate, the world will stand up. We are not standing up. So COVID is happening. We are all very scared. I'm talking for myself. I'm scared. So what can we do here as a community, you know, to support each other, to join the petitions, to sign the statements, you know, to join our voices to others that are trying to do good. And I wonder, Karen, if you have some thoughts about it, and if maybe the survivors or you know, second generation or other teachers, Mary Lee's here from Houston and a few others, just so curious to know, you know, how can we raise our voice now when it's really needed?
So I would like to ask, Tali, thank you for that mention. I'm about to embark on a really interesting and challenging series of interactions with our community. And it's a 6-session series that will be called Creating Possibility, Disallowing Hatred. And we're located in a Holocaust museum in Houston, in the United States, and we are a 501c3. So if anybody knows anything about tax codes in the United States, there's a great challenge in my work, I think, because I don't know how to do this work that we're talking about today without having political location of self and values, which is something we're not supposed to do. So in my upcoming work, I'm trying to figure out how we talk to each other, and how in a culture that's made about individualism, as is your culture in South Africa in many ways, how do we work across those challenges? And I would love, there's been some really interesting conversation here today, and I would love to keep in touch with you all. Thank you.
Mary Lee, I think we're a 501c2, you know. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the things that's happened and does happen in these kinds of environments is partisanship gets conflated with democracy. They're not the same thing, right? And so at a certain point in the United States, and this happened also, it's happened in other countries, talking about democracy itself protecting democracy itself suddenly becomes partisan. That's a very dangerous thing, but you can also identify it as a dynamic. And so I think there's also a difference between naming political realities, naming the facts on the ground, and supporting people to make connections. And I'll just say from research we've done in Northern Ireland and other places, there's a danger when you actually don't do that. Because when we found that especially young people in Northern Ireland got the message from their educators and the adults around them that the troubles are unmanageable. Right. If you can't talk about it, you can't do anything about it. So there's an efficacy connection between raising the issues, being able to explore them, and then talking about what you might be able to do about it. Now, you're going to have all kinds of ground rules about the conversation. You know, we do like our fostering civil discourse stuff. But that's different than we can't talk about it. This is political. Political and partisan are different things, right? So give people back their democracy and allow them to own it and the components of it that matter, because when we start to say democracy itself is too fraught, we've abandoned already, right?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And as I said, we are a community, and I do encourage people to be in touch with Karen, be in touch with you, Mary Lee, with us, of course, our colleagues here from the other centers in South Africa. And we can encourage each other and help each other in what is a increasingly difficult world. So Karen, thank you very much to you and of course all your colleagues at Facing History and ourselves for allowing us to look at your wonderful resources, reflect back at the past, look at ourselves today, both as societies, but also ourselves today as individuals. And I think that is a real gift that you gave us all today. And we look very much forward to work with you and with your colleagues in the very near future, definitely on Zoom, but hopefully also face to face. And thank you all of you for joining us this evening, this morning, this afternoon. Hopefully you can join us again. We have a weekly series of webinars. Next week, for example, we have the wonderful Liz Elsby from Yad Vashem speaking about art and survivors in art, you know, and what they created after the Holocaust. So it's different angles of looking at the past. And we will do much more in the weeks to come, in the months to come. So we wish you all safety and be well, and we will see you hopefully very, very soon. Good night and all the best.